Welcome to another episode of the Educators Podcast. And I have my guest. Listen, you're not a guest if you come on twice, bro. You're not a guest if you come on twice. And so, um, Michael, talk to the people, man. Tell them who you are. Tell them where you're coming from, and let's go.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm Michael Sousa. I live in Oakland, California, amidst the oaks and the redwood trees and all the beautiful people. I have been working in school since 2000. Um, I was the first in my family to go to college, and when I went to college, I realized that there needed to be more first generation college students. So I started working in schools and led high schools for 10 years. Got to do some great work with families at the Oakland Reach for about 3 years. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about family leadership, family partnerships today. And yeah, I'm the son of Gisela and Jose. And I'm the husband, the father of Rosa, Joseph, and Jaden. So I'm bringing all that with me this morning or
I
this
love that.
afternoon. Yeah.
I love that. So let me ask you a question real quick before we jump in. How do you feel like being a first gen college student? I'm also a first gen college student. How do you feel like the impact of your family, of your mother and father, like what impact did that have on you, and like how does that now portray in your own parenting?
Yeah. Well, I say it's obviously a huge net positive. I think growing up as like an immigrant household, my parents were the kind of immigrants where they reminded us often of their childhoods, and they reminded us often of what they had to go through. Um, and they also like created a sense of identity for what it meant to be Azorian or what it meant to be from the islands. Like in some ways like a good way, right? Like, hey, like we are hardworking people. Like we don't we like we make good choices. We don't waste our money, right? Like a lot of the same stories I hear from a lot of different immigrant families and a lot of Black families. Like you are part of something that's important, and like never forget who you are. Like that was very much instilled in me. And I would say there's also these kind of elements of kind of bootstraps mentality that was very common as well, which it took a while for me to kind of deconstruct. But just like there's that I had to make sense of. And they named me Michael. They didn't name me Miguel, right? Like they made some choices about figuring out how to make sure our family had access to the power and privilege of fitting into white dominant culture. And so yeah, I think obviously my parents were amazing, and just like I always think like, man, I can't, nothing I do will compare to like what they've been able to do. I mean, so yeah, just keep on referencing the sacrifices and work. And I don't know if you know, my mom is like, she became like a real estate like guru. I
I
don't talk
didn't know.
about
I
this.
didn't know that. Yeah, you
So
don't talk
she
about that.
so they came to the States in like the early 60s, and they had an opportunity to take over like this failing dry cleaners, which is
Mm,
also funny because like I'm pretty sure they didn't even know what dry cleaning was on the islands, right? But like okay, we'll try this out. They ran a really successful dry cleaners. People in the city loved them. We had like contracts with the police department, like all the people, like everyone knew my dad. People loved my dad. But when my mom had me, she stopped working. But she's like not the kind of person that could stop working. So a year after she had me, she started buying property,
wow.
and then she built 3 apartment complexes and our house without a general contractor. She was the general contractor.
I
So this
love
like
that.
little woman just like with a third grade education was just like, I'm gonna make it happen. So I just remember driving all over the Central Valley, whatever, to like get supplies to build the house and plumbing and light fixtures, and just see my mom talk to these like big old dudes that were doing like framing the house and making sure they're doing what they need to do. It's just like she's just an inspiring woman, man. So when I say like the things they've accomplished, it's pretty significant.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you sharing that, right? Like I think a lot of us don't really share the struggles that our parents have gone through and the triumphs, right? Like matter
Yeah,
of fact, no, we share the struggles, but we don't
yeah.
necessarily share the triumphs, right? So like thank you for mentioning that. Um what do you feel like are some of the biggest challenges parents face today?
Man, I saw the question and I was like, man, it's just so much. Just to be honest, I mean, it could be from basics like they're worried about their kids' addiction to social media and games and being how much time they're online, and then they're like comparing their parenting to other people's parenting, and they're like, I think so. There's that. There's like the addiction to social media, and there's been amazing reports put out by the Surgeon General and guidance. So that's obviously, if the Surgeon General is putting out guidance around technology, obviously that's a serious issue in our country. Just as good as anyone, like the number of young people who aren't at grade level in terms of their skills, they're not on track to be able to be really ready for college. That's a massive. I mean, there's millions of children in our schools that are not accessing the skills yet that they need to be successful. So that's like stressful and overwhelming. I mean, I live in Oakland. Like I see what's going on in East Oakland every day, and just like the historic divestment that families are having to deal with, like not having access to quality schools, safe parks, clean streets. Like that's stressful, man. And then you put on top of just all the other kind of systemic issues. So it's hard for me to pick one. There's just like, and when I talk to families, there's whether they're a privileged family with means, they're worried about things, and people who are struggling with economic challenges and having to deal with kind of racist policies and racist kind of systems. There's a lot. And I think for me, if I could just move to the solution, I do think we're in a moment where to really think about how to make families feel really connected to each other is important. And I think schools who are finding ways to make parents not just feel like the school sees them, but like create opportunities for families to feel connected to families. Because I think that's what I learned during COVID. Like we were running these meetings every 2 weeks online with families. We had a hell of people show up. We had like 150 people in the room sometimes. And that was like schools couldn't even get like 15 families to show up sometimes, but we were getting like hundreds of people show up. And what people told us is, one, they appreciated space to just talk about what it means to be a parent right now. They appreciated some space for joy and just connecting with each other. I mean, I think I think schools miss out on opportunities to build community left to right. I think they only think about like school to family, but like how can we connect family to family? Because it takes a village, man. So
100% it takes a village, right? And that's in any community, any racialized group. It takes a
yeah,
village to raise a child.
yeah,
So let me ask you this: like, let's kind of dive into your work as a school leader, right? And
yeah,
so as a school leader, like we know that some of these grades are inflated in
yeah,
terms of just like how they come out, and like a lot of kids, I think particularly in East Oakland, Dr. Charles Cole talks about his story a lot in terms of reading the grade, the way that you guys measure the grades in Oakland. I think it's A to C. Um,
yeah. They take out the D and the D so that you either pass or you fail. There's no D because D's are not eligible for college.
yeah, and so segueing into that, it's like he talks about he's spoken about how he was a straight A student and then got to college and had to take remedial classes. So let's talk about grades and like
Yeah,
what parents should look for.
yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done to make families feel like they can and deserve to engage with the standards and types of work that our students that their children are expected to complete. And I think the grading inflation is connected to the whole study around like whether or not our young people have access to grade level appropriate tasks, right? So the TNCP put out the opportunity myth, right? Like how many young people are in schools and they just never even get a chance to try grade level work, right? And so the same thing is like, to what do families ever get to look at what grade level work looks like? And so I remember we led one of the most powerful workshops at the Oakland Reach when we were running the literacy campaign. We just brought all these families into one space, and I found like the dopest teachers who really knew the standards, and they just had little groups based upon grade level, and they let families engage with the state assessments. So they just could know like, oh, like this is what my kids should be able to do. Like this is like even a paragraph. Like this is a paragraph of what your child should be able to read. And you could see some of the families like, my kids are never reading paragraphs. Like they're like never writing more than like. And so people had this moment of like, oh damn, like they presume. And to go back to the immigrant story, like a lot of us presume we came to this country because we're trying to get our babies a good education, and then they look like, man, like they're not even giving my kid a chance to practice the skills that they need to be at grade level. So, I mean, I think the grade inflation is real, and the work deflation, right? Like the actual what we're giving young people is also like, so like it's like a double whammy. So they're getting B's, but they're getting B's on work that's not even
Yeah,
at grade level, right?
yeah, 100%.
So
Yeah,
I think when Charles talks about being able to get all A's and still not be ready, yeah, you got inflated grades, and you likely were never asked to actually do grade level work very often.
Yeah, but then think about it, right? It's like you have these inflated grades, but then you have kids that are in suburbia that they have access to a lot of things that kids in the inner city and kids in rural areas don't necessarily have access to. And so you
Man,
got these kids, you got these kids that are coming in with a 5.8 GPA weighted
yeah,
based off of AP courses and all the things, right? And so now you're expecting a kid from the inner city that does not have any access to any of these things to now compete with you to get into Harvard.
yeah. Ray, I didn't tell you this. Like, we are in the middle of choosing a high school for my daughter.
Okay, nope, you didn't
Let me
tell me
tell
this.
you how many hours and conversations, man. It's like this existential moment.
Yeah,
And I think, I mean, that's another stressful thing is like, what schools do I send my baby to? Right. I think
yes,
some families are in situations where they don't feel like they have choices, or they literally don't have choices. But here, like, we are in a situation where we're not really excited about really any of the public schools, any of the charter schools. I mean, I might be okay with a few of them. So we're looking all over. I'm looking at transfer policies. I'm looking at Catholic schools. I'm looking at selling my house. Like, I'm looking at everything, and
yeah.
that is a shame.
Yeah,
That,
listen, I was talking, Doc. I was talking to a civic association today. They are giving us some hoopla in terms of our building out our high school, right? And
yeah,
so I was telling them the story of like I'm in a position to where when I didn't like the high school choices for my kid, I was able to go out and buy a house in the district that I wanted to be in. Not everybody, hardly anybody, not everybody's an
yeah. You
understatement.
know, here
Hardly
it ain't like that.
anyone, right? Like
In the
hardly
Bay
anyone can
Area, you have to spend $4 million to get your kid to a good school. Like, that's crazy.
absolute 100%. So it means that, one, and as I was saying to them, it's like every school district should be a high performing school district. And it's like, how do we start having the conversation and putting the onus on these school districts to be high performing so folks don't have to go out and spend an arm and a leg, buy a new house, uproot themselves for a good school?
Yeah, and then, and once again, uh, unfortunately, there's still very few schools that are able to buck socioeconomic trends, right? I look at your
Well,
school, and I lots of love for you and what you all have been able to achieve, and show that you can get positive and strong outcomes for learning with a diverse and different socioeconomic backgrounds. My school was one of the only schools in the Bay Area. Like, we were like top performing for low income Latino students. But it's just like few and far between, right? Like, we have these like diamonds, these like unique schools that can work against the socioeconomic situations that are happening. But that's like a larger systemic issue to recognize. Like, school quality is often associated with whether or not families have money.
yeah.
And so
Yes.
right. I mean, you just look on real estate postings, it literally says the name of the school on the real estate listing.
If
Like,
you're buying a house, the first question you ask is, how are
yeah,
the schools?
yeah. So we've already internalized, it's just like a normal part of American society that if you have money, you get to buy into a good school.
Yeah.
And like, it's people like you and I who are in educational justice talk about it all the time, but like the average American's like, oh yeah, that's, of course. You have more money, you get to go to better school. Like, that's the degree to which it's just normalized that if you're
Yeah.
poor, you don't get to go to great school, and that's just jacked up. So
Way jacked up. So let me ask you this, right? Like from your work in schools, your work with Oakland Reach, and then the work that you're doing now, like
yeah,
what's your suggestions in terms of parents building relationships with teachers, right? Because like I feel
yeah,
like those relationships can now be leveraged, right, to kind of counteract some of this grade inflation.
yeah. Well, I do think that one of the things that families, and really, I mean, I always put more responsibility on the educators, but you asked me what should families do, so I'm gonna go there first. Uh,
Yeah.
that families should just recognize that like a lot of teachers aren't used to engaging with families in a real authentic way. It becomes like transactional, like you need to send home the grade report, or if X happened in school, then I need to give you Y. Like, it's just this like very kind of mechanical, instrumentalized relationship. And I think what I do with teachers is like, I'm gonna actually just like be hella kind to you and ask you
Hmm.
how you're doing and build relationship with you, so
Hmm.
that when it gets hard and when I need to say something to you, like, I've already had positive relationship with you, and I'm down, I'm trying to support you.
Yeah.
And that's the same story I would do when I'm coaching teachers. Like, hey, if you're going to engage with families, your first call best not be a negative call about that baby,
Of course not. Yep.
right? But that's
Yep.
often what happens, right? And so I think the
Yep.
same thing families should. I always encourage families like, hey, let the teacher know who you are. Let them know your values and your goals for your child. Like, what does it look like when a family shows up and the first time they engage with the teacher is like, hey, so like Rosa, she's like really loves reading. She struggles with writing. She's a baller in math, and our family's expectation for her is for her to go to a great university someday, right?
Yeah.
That teacher will now see my daughter in a different way for like they best see my daughter in a different way, right? And I think sometimes
One.
our teachers don't always look at every child as if their family expects them to be destined for greatness. They start making
Yeah.
presumptions about our babies, and so I think I always tell families, don't wait too long to let them know how much you love your baby and how much you expect of them. And then,
One of the things that I see and that I've seen in 20 plus years of being in education is that we put a lot of onus on parents in terms of showing up to these back to school nights, showing up to these events at school.
yeah,
And we don't necessarily take into account the fact that these parents got to work 2 jobs in order to show that they really love their kids in order to put food on the table, right?
yeah,
And so what's your message to educators that look at parent engagement through this middle class lens?
yeah. Oh, I would say we should be thinking of many different ways to be with families, and now I mean, just basic like the difference between sending a personal text versus the automated caller. Like
Yeah.
it was very clear to me, like families, like, hey, if you send me a text from your phone, right, or even if it's a remind and I can reply to you, right, like their
Yeah.
likeliness to engage, because schools send out some schools send out too much information, and like families just get drowned in it. They don't even want to look at it anymore. And there's
Yeah.
very little systems to like bring information in from outside the school in. So, I mean, I think when I talk to teachers, is like find a way. If you feel like you don't have enough time, at least pick the students that you know you need to invest in because you see maybe they're not able to show up in school the way you want them to, or they're struggling with the skills. Like pick the students and then just build a real relationship that's not transactional. That shows the parent, shows the student that you love them, you care for them, and it pays dividends.
Well, it's like your investment in friendships, right? It's like
Yeah,
you're not gonna necessarily be friends with people that withdraw more than they deposit, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
as a teacher, if you're thinking along the same lines, it's like if you're depositing into these families, right? Then when it comes time for you to withdraw, then you're not gonna go bankrupt in one
yeah,
conversation if you've deposited several envelopes of
yeah.
information
Exactly.
in goodwill.
Yeah, and it and I when we were working with so at the local reach, we were training community members to become literacy teachers that would work side by side with a credential teacher. And often we would tell them like, "Hey, you're there to show the way, because you're actually like these kids are your like your nephews and nieces or your own baby is actually in the
Yeah.
school, right?" And so what we would talk to them is like we have to model to the teachers, uh, especially because we know some of our teachers weren't engaging with families and students, that you have to model unconditional love. We actually talked about Dr. King's quotes around agape, like this idea of real love is not I love you because you're likable. I don't love you because you love me back. I literally just love you because you're worth like all people are worthy of love, right? Like because God loves you, and I think that is hard for teachers when they're feeling burnt, when they're feeling overworked, when there's a sense of like there's a scarcity of time that sometimes it's easier to give our energy to people who are likable than it is to give our energy and love to people who maybe stress you out. And so
Yeah.
I think people need to build their own families too, man. We got to build our own mindfulness practice to recognize like who are we intentionally avoiding, who are we really not engaging with, because those are probably the people we need to give more to.
Yeah, you said something earlier that resonated for me in terms of parents discussing their desires for their kids, right? And I don't think that we as schools give them the platforms to be able to one advocate and tell you their kid's story.
Yeah,
Because I'm a firm believer in the fact that you are your child's first teacher. And so who better to talk to me about the things that my child is liking than a parent, right? And I know, it's a spectrum in terms of like what a parent may be able to express in terms of the needs of their kid, right? But then
Yeah.
that you as an educator, you have to be an open-eared listener in terms of listening and digesting what these parents are saying, and be able to then take that and put that into practice. What are your thoughts on that? Like, what strategies do you have for parents in
Yeah.
terms of like having those real conversations?
Well, I did some reflecting because one of the in our prep for this meeting, I was thinking around what are some suggestions, and the most basic suggestion I've been giving to schools is look at all your family engagement events or processes, and if you are talking at them for more than 75% of the time, then you're doing it wrong. And if you think of the average back to school night, god dang, it's literally sit in that chair. I'm gonna talk at you. In high school, it's the worst because you go for like 6 classes and you had like 6 teachers just talking to you for 20 minutes, and you get up and you go to the next room. And so, just basic, like give all families an opportunity to share, to connect. I mean, I remember one year our back to school night, we had all the families write the aspirations for their children on this massive poster we put on the
Oh, I
wall,
love that.
and
Yeah,
we kept it up for the whole month. And I said, don't put
yeah,
your child's name. We're gonna let all the babies look at all this love for all children. And they won't even know whose is whose, and they can just see all these beautiful goals for their children on the wall. And like that year was different for families. They felt like their like kind of fingerprints were on like culture of the school. So just those kinds of activities. We used to hold a lot of. We had a circle. Probably the most powerful circle we had for families was talking about the challenges of raising children across generations and across culture. So I had a bunch of moms come like Mr. Sousa, like our kid. Like when I tell my kid to get off their phone, they like yell at me. Like they're like when I tell them they can't play video games, they like it's like they go through withdrawals. And so we had to have a conversation about technology. And we just sat in circle and talked about like, what was it like when you grew up? And then we had a lot of people in my school, like my parents, they didn't have running water or electricity. And so they're thinking like, now we got to raise kids in this age. Like, have they even thought like, what does this mean to this change in our generation? Right. And so I remember the conversation we had that really got people crying. I asked them, do you think that your family stories is having a greater impact, or do you think technology is having a greater impact on the values that your child has? And everyone just kind of like got quiet and they're like, man, we got to do something. Like, because they all realize like they're getting way more inundated with messaging from what's on their screen than they are from each other. And so I use that as an example of families that year, and from that kind of culture, like we're going to come and talk about what it means to be a parent. And we're going to talk about
yeah.
what's going well. What do we want for our kids? Like we can share real stories about parenting, because I also think that sometimes we don't live in a culture where it's okay to admit that you're having a hard time sometimes.
You're 100%
The
right
parenting
with
is
that.
hard, man.
Yeah, yo, listen, you're a parent, I'm a parent, we both know that, right? And there's certain vulnerabilities in communities that don't allow you to express the difficulties that you may be having in parenting. And so we try to do some things at our school to kind of knock down those barriers so parents feel a little bit more freely with expressing the difficulties that they're having. And I feel
Yeah.
like we've done a good job with that. But it takes you putting in the work as a school, right? Like you can't just expect for these things to just happen by chance. You got to put in the work. And so you, as someone that has been a school leader, been a part of some kick butt organizations or whatever, you put in the work. And so what advice do you have for the schools that are not putting in the work and things that they could do?
Yeah. So a lot of the work I'm doing now is this idea of gathering voices of all community members, like young people, parents, staff, teachers, and really just listening to like what are people experiencing. And I think if you're at a 0 point in terms of family engagement and developing family relationships and family leadership, I think doing some focus groups, doing some empathy interviews of like how are families experiencing school, how or how are students experiencing school, how are staff experiencing school, often has been transformative, because people like, I didn't know it was like that. Because we often ask questions on surveys that feel like almost too specific, right? Like, how do you like the grading system? Like, or how do you like the grade report? Or we actually just ask them like, tell us about what it's like being a family at the school. Like, what does it feel like when you walk on campus? And like really just get the stories underneath the surface. I think that if you have that one, you'll have families feeling heard in a way that they've never felt heard. And you'll have these stories to connect with staff. Like, this is why we got to do it, because our families should feel whole here. They should feel like they belong. They should feel like they're partnering with us. And so I have seen both the act of listening to families in that way as transformative, and then the result of the work, that the stories that come out of that. And I think a lot of what we did at the Reach was constantly asking families, what are they experiencing in their schools, more holistically. Like, just tell me, how's your baby doing at school X? Like, just tell us, like, how are you feeling? And then our programming would always shift, and our supports would shift based upon what we hear from families. So if you're at stage one, don't do another damn survey. Please don't do another survey. Man, we over survey families, and we know we only get to hear from some families. I
Yeah.
would say pick 10 families, 15 families that you think are the most important to hear from, and sit with them for like 25 minutes and really just listen, and then do
Yeah.
the work to make meaning of what you hear from them. And start small, and try some practices. And that's a lot of the work we're doing at Learning Heroes. So the principals who are part of the Learning Heroes Fellowship that I'm supporting, they get to come together once a month to reflect on what does research say about what works for a family engagement. But they also get a leadership coach. Get to work with 9 principals from across the country in that. And then they all are trying what we call safe to fail experiments. Really just try something different to build trust
Oh
with
yeah.
families.
Love that.
Try something different around how to engage families with the standards and learning that their child's doing. Try something different with new systems and structures, right? And so we're seeing principals try small things and find wins. And we're seeing principals grow a lot because they're willing to share with each other with like what's working and not working. Because,
Yeah.
often when you ask principals about family engagement, they're always like, oh, like no one ever shows up. And they like have this sense of like defeatism. They're like, oh, we can't, it's never going to be. And hearing people struggle, but also win has been
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah. So you may mention a buzzword. Well, not necessarily a buzzword, but like a strategy that I know that folks don't use. And that you only the trained ear would hear this, right?
Yeah.
You said something about empathy surveys. So
Yeah.
walk me through like your idea of an empathy survey and how a person that's laid to research could bring that and use that as a tool.
Yeah. I've learned a lot about empathy interviewing through National Equity Project work around liberatory design. And so they have a great resources there if folks want to check it out. But essentially is instead of getting down to the granular practices or specific questions that usually we ask in surveys that have like a 1 to 5, literally you want to go up higher to an open-ended question about kind of feelings and stories. So an example of something is, tell me a time where you felt a great sense of belonging at
Oh
school,
wow.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you're like, no, tell me more, and then tell me more about that one time. Like, why was it like that? Tell me what it felt like, right? And you just keep
Yes.
going deeper into stories and emotions. And what we found is when you ask people these kind of open-ended questions, the type of truth you end up getting out of it usually points you at a basic fundamental need or basic fundamental kind of root
Yes, sir.
cause to why people don't experience school we want them. So I'm doing this with like 4 or 5 now orgs. Like we're doing with in the city of Hayward, we're doing it in Bellevue, Washington, we're doing it in
Yeah.
a school in East Oakland, and each of them are finding like, man, not only does the person that I was interviewing feel different by the end, I feel different because the way I listen to them, and so then it
Yes.
changes the way that we. So a lot of the coaching I do is around recognizing when we're in transactional relationships versus transformative relationships,
Of
and
course. Yeah.
empathy interviewing is all about transformation. Like I'm willing to be different because of the time I spent with you, and I hope that you
Yeah.
could be different because of the time I spent with you. And it's not just me extracting wisdom from you, but it's like the act of listening is powerful within itself. And then, but that being said, you got to do something with what you hear, and you got to get back to that person because there's no
100%.
way to
Yeah.
ruin trust if you're like, man, I spent 30 minutes talking to that dude, but no one's ever got back to me about what we're doing
Never
next.
heard anything about this. Never talked to me about the survey data. Like schools do that as well, right? We get all this survey data, and then we don't ever talk to the parents about what we're doing with this data or like how we've taken the suggestions and put them into play, right?
And,
So
and you
yeah,
got to
go
be
ahead.
honest. A lot of us just use those surveys just to get things done that we already wanted to get done. We like,
Yeah, absolutely right.
yeah, we write the surveys so that we can just prove our points instead of actually like doing them with the sake of actually listening.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that, right? We did things a little differently with our surveys. What I did was I had my principals go back and look at the survey data and then talk about the things that they have implemented since that survey to where parents know and feel safe with completing the next survey because
Yeah.
they know that that data didn't fall on deaf ears, right?
Yep.
And so it's helpful. We're about to run. Actually about to run that podcast this week for parents to kind of digest and then give me feedback on. Right. So like one of the things that I feel like we do really well is we listen, right? And we don't listen with the intent to respond. We listen to kind of take things in to make things better for kids.
Yeah.
And the last thing that I'll say about surveys is that you got to survey these kids, right? Because they are the end users of education, and they are the ones that are being benefited the most on the front lines. And if you're not willing to hear what they're trying to say, then you're really not a good educator. And I
Yep.
mean that purposely.
Yeah.
Whenever I was gonna have a formal observation from a principal, I always said to myself, I'm like, yo, if I really want to know how I'm doing, I need to ask these kids
Yeah.
because they are the ones that are experiencing education.
That's right. Yeah.
So I'll walk you through a scenario. We'll close up and then I'll walk you through a scenario, right? So here's a scenario. You got a kid that's been in a system for 13 years, right? And for 13 years, this kid has been experiencing A's, B's, no real red flags for parents in terms of throwing up the flags of how their kid is doing. You got this parent or parents, let's not use deficit language. You got parents that are together and that trust the school system. So they're not really asking any questions. They're just looking at the report card data, the interim not necessarily the interim assessments, but the progress reports and things of that nature, and just believing that. Kid gets to 12th grade after 13 years of being in the same system, can't read, can't function. They're thinking that this kid is about to start applying for colleges and universities across the country. And then there's just this deficit in terms of this kid now being at like an 8th grade reading level and not just really being able to function the way that a college freshman would be able to function.
Yeah.
Who's at fault?
Who's at fault?
Who's at fault?
I would definitely say the education system, if we believe systems are responsible for creating justice. Because that story you just told, there are people in our communities that are more likely to have that story than other people in the communities. And so if that's a predictable pattern that low income Black and brown folks are more likely to have that experience you just described, then you got to know it's the system's problem. But I often, me, you follow me on social media. I'm not the either or kind of person. So system first for sure. But I think we got to hold two truths at the same time. Like we got to hold everyone accountable and help everyone. And but I know that story you told is unfortunately so common.
Yeah.
And when you were telling the story, I was thinking more like, how does that young person feel? Because there's all the work that needs to be done so that young person can get the skills. But imagine what it feels like to be an 18-year-old who can only read at the 7th or 8th grade or can barely do algebra. To what degree have they engaged with the reality of their state, right? Of their skills. And then, in Oakland, we're dealing with like a lot of community stress right now, man. There's a lot of young people who don't have an outlet to be productive. And so we got a lot of young people just making really bad choices. I mean, we just got this video last week.
Really bad choices.
A youngin' just taking like 15, walking into the Apple store and just taking 15 phones.
That's a national video. That's a nationwide video. So
yeah.
I didn't realize he was 15 years old. I thought he was older.
No, that's where we're at. Like, what do you expect a 15-year-old boy to do if they know that their school has never prepared them for a life of opportunity? Yeah. Like, what do we expect from our young people, right? Like, and likely his parents. What was like? I wish every time we find someone who made a horrible mistake like that, what school they go to? What's the proficiency rate? Yes. What's the proficiency rate of that? That's the first thing that comes to my mind when I see these things. Like, what school did that young person go to, and how many kids are leaving that school at grade level? Because we want to blame that kid, but like, what school did we put him in?
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
So when you say the system, when I say the system, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification, but we definitely got to take some ownership. So, Doc, tell folks how they can find you on socials. Tell them what you're doing because you're doing some amazing stuff, and you got the final word. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm blessed to do work all over. I'll share 3 of my favorite projects right now. Big shout out to Donnie Tran and the Center for Innovative Education. We're doing an amazing community engaged strategic planning process up in Bellevue, Washington. Love that work. I get to do a lot of great work in place-based learning and community connections in Hayward, through the Hayward Promise neighborhoods. That's amazing. But big shout out to my big, huge partner, Learning Heroes, who connected me to be with you today. Learning Heroes is doing amazing work to make sure that principals and school leaders and family engagement folks are really thinking about how to change the dynamic that's existed for too long, where families don't feel like they belong, and families don't feel connected. Families don't feel like they have a role in their child's education. So shout out to all the folks there and the work we're doing. If you're listening to this podcast and you want to figure out how to do better for family engagement, go to learningheroes.org. Check out the Family Engagement Leadership Institute. Check out all the amazing reports we've done around family engagement. The latest one was around grade inflation. Learning Heroes is doing really important work, and I appreciate being able to do work with them. And that's where I'm coaching a bunch of principals and supporting community schools up in Sacramento. So you can follow me at Michael D'Souza 5 at Michael D'Souza 5 on Twitter, or just go to LinkedIn and search Michael D'Souza. You'll find me there too.
Yeah, brother. Thank you for coming to kick it with me on the Educators podcast. Shout out Learning Heroes. And I appreciate you, man. You moved me today. Your words are gonna get me through the rest of the day. I feel resolved and I feel seen.
There we go.
You've been listening to the Educators